Recorded live at 3rd Street Stuff in Lexington, Kentucky, we're talking space over coffee. This is episode 2, Food in Space. How will that work? Moderated by Kris Kimel. Having coffee with Bob Perry and Mike Canga.
So when you talk about food in space, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, Mike is one of the, having a key leadership position in NASA on deep space missions involving human health and also cooking food, issues like that, nutrition, and Bob, you being a former chef and a food systems researcher, which you spent a lot of your career, and then also, very involved in doing a lot of work, I know, in neurogastronomy, which is a really top topic we'll get to. It seems to me that when we talk about space, there's a lot of hard problems and challenges that there's a lot of time spending about, and we dig deep. But food is one of the ones that maybe outside the small expert circles that we seem to approach in a kind of a haphazard way, like we'll just figure it out. Is that?
That's, well, I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
But what I would say is that I think food is considered an easy problem by the uninitiated. Everybody knows kind of how to cook, or at least where to get dinner. Everybody sees food and feels like they have an understanding of it. But the deeper issues about how to provide a safe and nutritious diet for multi-years and all of the psychosocial issues around food are the real problems for deep space missions.
And that's what you said is one of the most important things, the social aspect of food. Rob Dunn's book, Delicious, he's an anthropologist at NC State, I believe. He said even the earliest populations that they've been able to study always gather around the table. Mm-hmm. Food is community, food is our social. So it's very important, and you know how to cook and astronauts got to eat, but you also have to figure out their nutrition. Can the food last? And there's just so many factors. It's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, and I know sometimes when I get into conversations about it, people will say, well, we've learned a lot from space station and things like that, which I completely agree, of course. But I also remind them that it's 260 miles up, and they get fresh food delivered every couple of months. Not enough to last. So it's not the same experience. And when you talk about lunar and Mars, that's a whole different challenge that we face. Mike, from your experience, when we talk about humans going back to the moon, which is, we have our first crewed mission back to the moon since 1972, and Artemis 2 coming up, and then the next Artemis 3 they're going to land. What's the ballpark, or how long do you think, once we're kind of there for a while, that humans will actually, one crew will spend on the moon?
That's a good question. So the early missions will be short.
Right.
I haven't been in the planning for a long time, but we were eventually looking at having either somebody cislunar for 6 months, or perhaps lunar base if we got that. Well, when we get that.
Yeah, and cislunar being.
So the plan is to have a habitat in orbit near the moon, and they would depart on excursions from that habitat down to the lunar surface. So that habitat will have a longer band presence.
Okay, and I assume that that's kind of in the early stages before we've actually said, okay, we're going to have people living and working on the moon for months at a time.
Because this is, I'm not going to say it's like station, because it's a very different technical problem, but solving the problems of a microgravity environment and a system, we have a lot of experience with that, whereas surface systems are going to take a lot more research.
So just your guesstimate, based on your experience, once we get beyond that a little bit and we start putting humans on, say, okay, we've got some sort of outpost here in which they can still go, but there's going to be people. What's your thoughts on how long, and even how long will people actually, if they're even on, is it still called Gateway?
Yes.
So if they're on Gateway, I mean, even so, how long is the mission's going to be for you?
I think the longest is probably 6 months.
Okay.
I'm sure there will be quite a few shorter missions.
Okay. So we're not looking at years.
No, not
Okay.
multi-year missions, because the transport is relatively straightforward compared to, say, Mars.
Yeah.
And then Gateway will be able to be supplied. There's a low energy pathway. The reason Gateway is where it is because there's a low energy pathway to get supplies to Gateway, which means we'll be able to do some regular resupply.
Okay.
And that's huge.
Yeah. So I want to set a context before we kind of get into this a little bit more. So when we talk about, first of all, let me go back. Space station is relatively close.
Right.
Moon's a lot farther. Mars is a lot farther. So if we have let's say we have a Gateway, an orbiting lunar space station in a sense, that's going back and forth. Given the money and the complexity, because I know, I do know that, food is delivered to the station on a periodic basis, fresh food and that kind of. What is the likelihood and how often, given the cost and complexity of actually delivering food to Gateway?
I can't even answer that.
Okay.
What I will say is they will supply. So station food, I think shelf life is max of 3 years. Actually, I'm sorry. We'll say a year, and some of it's extendable. So every 3 to 6 months probably would be a reasonable resupply rate, but it's dependent on crew size. The real thing that's going to determine the resupply rate for perishables is going to be their shelf life. So food and pharmaceuticals both will have finite shelf lives.
So let's just get beyond just the food and how often people get it. The other big issue we were talking about earlier is what are they actually going to eat? I mean, food is, because we all know that it's not enough just to get enough calories and nutrition. You've got to also, you've also got to find, food that keeps you psychologically fit and on equal bearing and being able to work, because you can't just survive, you got to thrive. So, Bob, given your work, I know you had an article in Space News not too long ago about your work in neurogastronomy.
Yeah, that dealt with neurogastronomy and how all the factors that affect how we eat, the smells, the sounds, the temperature of the room, the color of the plate, all these things can affect your appetite and how you eat. But eating in space is like eating on any kind of joint. I worked on private yachts and did long ocean cruises. So you have the principle of redundancy. So you start, you're going to eat all fresh food, and when that's gone, you're going to go to the next thing, which in dairy was UHT milk. When we used all the UHT milk, then we went to dried milk. And with 3 to 6 month supplies, it's not going to be that hard on the station. But going to Mars, it becomes a big factor. And the astronauts have to enjoy what they're eating. There's some fascinating studies out there that talk about preference in food in astronauts and how they generally tend to eat all the things they like first, and then slowly have to survive on what's left. So we need to make sure that what's left is as good as what they started.
Yeah, the issue where we are today is there's a limited menu. I don't know what the current list is, but there's something on the order of 300 menu items available, which sounds like a lot, but that's individual items, not 300 different meals. And so there's a lot of repetition in the diet, and that weighs heavily. So one of the big pushes has been to expand the variety, and lots of things you can make, but then it has to meet nutrition guidelines, has to be able to be packaged and come out of the package and be appetizing. So shelf life.
In some ways, we can't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Right.
Especially when it comes to other systems. I'm not even going to go there because I'm definitely not equipped for that. But in food, Jim Sears out in Colorado has invented this space appliance. It's a centrifugal oven pot. It's hard to describe it, but you can actually cook in it, and it satisfies all of NASA's requirements. That's the power usage, temperature, everything. And when astronauts have played with this, they can take food from their supplies and make things that we would have never thought about. The same way that I would go in my kitchen at home and look in the fridge and what do I have? Oh, let's put this together and make something new and novel. This is a way to actually cook in low gravity, no gravity, this little space appliance. It's really fascinating.
But that changes the system a little bit right now. So I keep saying food system, and that's what we call it because it's kind of a self-contained thing. Once you start providing the capability to cook and build your own food, then what you provide will change. And there's a lot of advantages to being able to cook. Like shelf life of whole grains is huge compared to shelf life of milled flour.
Let's take a minute. I'd like to kind of open this up to a mini brainstorming session. I thought as you guys were talking, I was thinking, let's talk about for a second all the variables that are that we can come up with that are going to be involved in actually preparing, well, basically receiving, whether it's growing or whatever, preparing, obviously, consuming, and getting into nutritional things, but also the issue of food in an extended space mission. Because I got mentioned earlier, one of the things that a lot of times people talk about things that they can do. But one of the factors, whatever you're doing, you've got to look at energy and mass. That's one of the factors that, you can have a refrigerator that works great on the moon, but if it's going to take up. So just off the top of your head, what are some of the other things that, go into the pot when we talk about food that have to be factored in? They're not just, we'll figure that out at some point in the future.
So, from my point of view, depending on the mission, preparation and prep time, supporting equipment that goes with it. For instance, shuttle basically had a warm water system to rehydrate the food. There's not actually a requirement to use dehydrated food because it doesn't save any mass. Since you have to carry the water up, you might as well just have it in food. And then we get the actual characteristics. So the nutrition, the electrolyte content, that's not probably the right word, but sodium, all of the other kind of electrolytes that go with it, which are critical to balance for bone health and for other reasons.
I was going to bring that up, that it's really a conundrum with food because salt is the one thing that cures food to make it last the longest. Because I did a lot of research in Spanish-style cured hams, prosciuttos, jamon. And, salted ham will last a good 3 years. It's still great after 3 years. But then you end up with the salt problem in the astronaut's body, so you have to figure out some sort of diuretic, then take the salt back out and get that balance. But that's really kind of a problem because most foods that we like are really salty. We're humans. We like salty stuff. We like sweet stuff.
And the second part of that same problem is once you're in space, all your fluids shift. You tend to be congested in space, which means a lot of your sense of smell is reduced, which is a major...
Which is the main thing in neurogastronomy is that most people don't understand that taste and flavor is really more in your nose than in your mouth.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about that. Andy, one of our Humanity in Deep Space webcasts we did a couple of years ago was on food in space, and we had and some of the issues and one of the people we had on there was actually a former captain of a nuclear attack sub, because they go underwater for 2.5-3 months, and It's not the same thing, but there's some similarities there. And we were talking about crews and crew prep and all that kind of stuff. And I asked him one time, I asked him during the conversation, obviously these crews have been through tremendous training. They're the fittest are only going to be on these deep space, these deep ocean subs. And I said, once you account for all the training and discipline and all that kind of thing, and you're underwater for 2.5, 3 months, what's the number one issue to keep everything on an even keel on the sub? And he said, food.
So it's the.
And of course they have. I think some of the time they actually train their chefs with 5-star chefs on these subs, and of course they have food. And that always stuck with me. When he talked, he said one time they had a mission, and it had to get extended, and they started to run low on food, and it started to cause real problems on the boat. So when we talk about that, how do we not that we can mimic that exactly, but how? If that's so critically important to effectiveness. Are there discussions about it? Are there discussions about however hypothetical they may be? How do we try to factor some of those things in, even though it's going to be really hard?
Yeah, there's plenty of research on the psychological component of food, and I'm actually going to defer to Bob, I think, for some of that. I am going to mention one thing, and then I'm going to drop it when we start talking about cooking in space, though, is that, and especially for these near-term missions, the astronauts aren't going up there to do housework. So actually, to a large extent, there's not a strong desire to have a large cooking, to actually be able to cook things in space. But I think on longer missions, the social aspect of community and gathering over food is going to be far more important.
Well, that's the important thing about this little device is it's not going to feed the crew. It's really just for special things. And Jim's been able to do some amazing things. He can make a cake. So if you have a birthday on the mission, you can actually have a real cake, freshly made.
And you got to have the ingredients. That's the other thing. You got to start thinking about
plan for that.
I agree.
And things like that are easy in this little appliance.
Yeah.
A cake mix and water, and you have cake. But in space, there's no way to cook it without this little appliance. So, yeah, it's really something that'll build morale and bring people together, not something to really feed the crew.
Right, and so for special occasions, those kinds of things are good. But thinking that we're gonna, put 50 pounds of beans and 50 pounds of flour sacks and go to Mars, and then somebody's gonna spend half a day making bread and that's not the way it's gonna work. So to a large extent, the food system is gonna be designed to have pre-packaged meals or easy to prepare meals.
Did we ever get an answer to the question? We talked about it a little bit, but just maybe this is one of the ones you said it's hard to estimate. Assuming we have Gateway and there's some people up there, how often will there be going and coming from Gateway, given cost and everything else?
Right now the U.S. component is once a year, right? And I think there might be changing that, but it's
not like 4 or 5 times a year.
Right.
So when you're talking about replenishing food supplies with fresher food and things like that, it's probably going to be not on the scale that we get Space Station.
I think the planning for the Gateway is going to be episodic. So you have this mission coming up, so you'll ensure that that mission is fully supplied before you commit the crew to the risk of a launch. Which of course means a prepackaged system by and large.
How do they deal? I know you and I have talked about this, Bob. I know you've done work in this area. Things like the other part that's really in part of the food paradigm, things like texture, things like smell. Smell, I'll let you, is obviously very, very critical to humans in so many different ways. I think, in so many things we don't even think about. So how obviously we get. I remember talking to an astronaut one time. I asked him what frustrated him. He said, "Well, one thing that's frustrating is we can't eat anything crunchy because the material gets into the atmosphere within the space station, and we can't have that. So when we have pizza, it's soft. I mean, little things that we wouldn't think about, but become annoying after a while. Are there any other? I mean, how do we?
Well, it's interesting. Our last 2 conferences ago in New York Astronomy, we partnered with it's a mouthful, International Neurologic Ketogenic Society, which is they work with children who have epilepsy, and they found that a keto diet almost eliminates those symptoms. But what's similar in space food and keto food is what you said. There's no crunch. There's no crunch in keto because there's no carbohydrates. There's no crackers, no breads, nothing to crunch. And sort of in space food too, you don't want any crumbs. So those 2 diets, really, I think we can look and find some things that each other can use.
What about smell? I mean, a little bit off. What about smell? Smell has a lot to do with us as fully functioning members of our species.
But when you're talking about eating, you're talking about retronasal smell.
Okay. Well, what I'm saying is, is there ever been, and eating is a part of that, but it's also, I have to, someone I work with has been an analog astronaut on a couple of missions. I think one time she went to, the Arctic for 8 weeks or something, and they lived in this place. And talking to her about, what are the things you miss the most? Of course, food immediately came in. But the other thing she said was, I miss the breeze on my face and the smells of nature. So, are there ways to contemplate, however out of the box they might be, of not necessarily the breeze, but actually supplementing smells from a psychological standpoint? Not that it's part of food, but other things.
Well, I mean, you could have an aerosol for a spray.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are ways, but I'm not sure that we've thought about that directly. That's actually a great question to see whether there have been
Well,
studies.
and Charles Spence's cross-modal research, he's played around with sound a lot. So you serve someone a seafood dish, meanwhile, the sound system has sounds of the ocean.
Yeah.
It just subtly, you don't really notice it, but it affects people the way they eat.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Proust in his, book talked about Madeline, taking him back. And I remember one time I was actually doing some work in Poland. I flew into Warsaw. My grandparents were Jewish, and so when I would visit them, they had a lot of cooking and stuff. And of course, they died quite a long time ago, and this wasn't that many years ago. And I remember I got out and as I started walking in Warsaw, I came around a corner, and suddenly I was transferred back to my grandmother's kitchen. And it's because somebody there was cooking one of the traditional Jewish dishes that she used to cook. And I was immediately like, boom.
Smell
I
has
was
the
back.
capability to directly activate memory.
Interesting sometimes just to talk about other ways of adding and utilizing different smells to trigger things in your brain.
That didn't smell the longest term. I mean, you can.
Probably.
Because what Kris just said, you smell something like it's just like, oh, it takes me back.
Yeah. Another question here. We obviously we don't, a couple things that complicate things, or not complicate in a normal sense, but make them much more challenging, is going even to the moon and then ultimately at some point to Mars. Is one, we're above the Van Allen belt, right? Which presents an issue. And the question is, so given the fact that we're above the Van Allen belt, which does provide some protection, radiation protection, to the astronauts. Do we know much about how that level of radiation would affect food over extended missions? If it would or wouldn't?
There has been a postulate that says it's not going to particularly affect the food. And part of that is based on the irradiated food experience, and part of it is energy equations. We actually asked that question directly, and there was an answer provided that said that is probably not something to worry about. I'm not sure I fully believe that answer, but
But that's what we have
a
so far.
very good radiologist provided it, so they have a lot more insight than I do. Where I thought you were going with that question, though, is that part of the nutrition, I mean, knowing that that's our environment also drives the nutrition profile, because we're talking about providing far more antioxidants and other nutrients that should help the body repair itself for that environment, which is, not an obvious thing to think about. It's actually being researched.
When you're talking about food and nutrition space, it's intertwined with radiation. It's intertwined with zero G. I mean, somebody said, well, prisoners, they're in solitary. I said, there's some similarities, but they're still in a 1G environment. They still occasionally look at and see trees and smells. So there's a number of factors involved in deep space missions that aren't there present when some of the things that happen on Earth. So given that, there's no really way to test for any of this stuff. Right? We can't really test for we can do some things on Earth, but we can't simulate, because we've never experienced it, the total experience of somebody spending a year, for example, let's say on the moon.
So that is true. The way you do that is either through analogs, and there's various versions, or models. And the typical model, when I'm talking about models, are either animal models. So I think the thought is for Gateway to have animal subjects up there so that we can look at long-term radiation effects and combined effects. And the new thing, which I'm sure is going to get bigger and bigger, is tissue on a chip, where you actually have, computer chips that have small cell cultures on them, so that they can actually look for what they're looking for.
One of the biomedical experiments that's going on Artemis 2 actually is with one of the companies that's is engaged in that is Space Tango, and they're looking at bone marrow organoids.
Right.
They're going to extract that and then basically put it in the capsule with the astronauts as close to them as they can, to look at how bone marrow, those organoids, function over a period of time.
That is fantastic.
And usually they're going to be doing more of that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, that's going to be the future biomedical research, because it's far more ethical than exposing a population of animals to unknown environments.
So yeah, again, ever since the beginning of all life on Earth, going back hundreds of thousands of millions of years, there's a lot of things have changed, climates, but the one thing that has remained constant, that every cell in our body has evolved in a 1G environment since the beginning of life. And I know there's no way to really project this out and understand it, but that seems to be a real problem.
Microgravity environment, that's where space station has helped us significantly, right? We've got years of research of microgravity and their effects on the human body.
Okay.
Up to the twin study with a 1-year exposure and a genetically about as similar as you could get control to look at the changes. So, it's fantastic we've been able to do that. The piece we really don't have is the synergistic effects of remoteness from Earth, the radiation environment, the microgravity environment, and whether those have any synergistic effects that might impact something more so than where we've tested. But that's why you take small steps.
Yeah. The other thing that's also been along with 1G is all life forms from the beginning have evolved as a part of and within nature.
Yeah, and that's
another one.
That was the thing I was going to mention very early on that I found fascinating, is when I first started with the food system, we were just beginning to look at the microbiome. For the first, I got to do my math now. 50 years, the idea was to have as sterile an environment as possible on the station or in any human, any crewed vehicle. And the point being, keep people from being sick and to not transmit anything. But a completely sterile environment would be imminently unhealthy,
Horrible for a human, yeah.
and numerous food products can't be flown. So no version of yogurt really is viable, and that is not quite true, but pretty close to true. So we have to figure out how to carry along the parts of nature we need with us, and the food system is a huge place to do that. And that's a future that probably is worth discussing, because up until about 10 years ago, the food system was designed to be sterile. And you know, you talk about sulfur preservation, but fermentation was another huge preservation technology that had unintended side effects for us.
It still is. I mean, the craze of kombucha and all this other business. The younger people like I personally can't go there. But yeah, and it's
Kimchi though. That
yeah, I
could
can
get
go
on.
there. But it's the gut-brain axis. You know, research recently has looked at how our stomachs are intimately connected with our brains, and things go back and forth. So it's
Yeah, I wanted to transition to get back to something you mentioned earlier, and that is the microbiome.
Right.
You know, the gut microbiome is responsible for, as you said, not only physical health, but psychological health, and all sorts of things. And again, not being able to simulate that above the Van Allen belt for long periods of time, not just a couple of months, but in the case of humans at some point going to Mars, at a minimum is 3 years. It's about 6 months to get there, a year and a quarter until you get orbital alignment, and then 6 months back. And in the early missions, before there's a Ritz-Carlton up there, there's a lot of challenges before we get any kind of infrastructure up there. I remember this same person actually did this when this was on this analog with me. Tiffany Vora. I mean, not on with me, but she was on the analog. I'm not going on analog mission. She mentioned that when they were there, they used a lot of hot sauce and things to add. And she said, "Go ahead."
Oh, I was just gonna say, on station, hot sauce, since the food has become lower sodium, hot sauce is the condiment of choice because you can taste it. It's not dependent on retronasal.
But she said after a couple of weeks, whenever they were doing this, or 2 or 3 weeks, I don't know what it was, month maybe, several of the crew members got very difficult gastrointestinal problems, which was not pleasant on a lot of levels.
Right.
And as they began to investigate it, they found out whoever who was doing the planning forgot to tell them or didn't factor it in that can really upset your microbiome system. And so, again, that's another one of those things that we really can't predict.
Getting back to the intent of this talk, nutritionists are raised on nutrition where somebody's either has a specific dietary issue or they've been going along in life and are trying to change something. Having really a serious outlook on holistic nutrition, especially in the face of constraints, probably doesn't really exist as a thought process right now. And that's one that would be huge because I'm sure whoever designed the analog mission followed what would have been considered very standard and good guidelines for a long duration mission like that, probably similar to what the Navy does. But when you start looking at all the constraints that are put around what's going to happen with the gut, the discipline of that is going to have to be different. The thought process is going to be different.
What about another part of food on off-planet? There are people that, institutions and people working on space agriculture. So, what about the idea of your perspective on the idea of growing real food on off-planet, whether it be the moon, which is one of his challenges, but certainly on going to Mars. Not only, so what is your...
I have some thoughts, but if you...
Well, I went 2 summers ago with Jim Sears because I helped him with his appointment. I went to the NASA Food Challenge up at Ohio State. And Jim was the only contestant to actually have something to cook for. Everything else was growing food. And these were amazing technological marvels. I mean, because they're trying to control not just temperature and light, but humidity and pressure. And most of them were growing, a lot of them were trying to grow cherry tomatoes. There were some leafy greens being grown. And I found it kind of funny because I was walking around looking at different things, and I asked a couple of different ones, well, how does it taste? And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. They're like, taste? We grew a tomato. It's like, yeah, but how does it taste? I mean, hydroponic foods are not that great in the first place. Then you consider something in that closed system. And one of the things I thought is that if you concentrated on growing not food per se, but enhancements to food. So if you grow fresh mint in one of these systems, and then you have a piece of chocolate and you put a fresh mint leaf on it and eat it, that's a whole different ballgame. Now you're getting something fresh, you're getting something that really will make your taste buds open up. So it's, I don't know that they're ever going to be able to grow a ton of food.
It depends on how far, right? So, I mean, the reason they're picking what they're picking is because it's very responsive to the experiments. Tomatoes are relatively easy to grow and get a fruit in. The microgreens have a double because they're easy, they're fast, and they kind of taste good. And leafy greens are certainly one of the things that are missing from the diet. Not to always be negative. Not to always be negative.
Well, let me say that. Let me make a point because I think it's relevant. I always, and I worry about that with myself. People think, oh, you're being negative, or say we're never going to do this. I don't. That's not what I think we're all about. What I have realized is that, we will probably do most of these things. I have no doubt that at some point in time humans will be on Mars. We'll have outposts on the moon and maybe even deeper space. But it's not going to happen until we're ready. And if we try to do it before we're ready, it's never going to be 100%. I get all that. So that's what it is. It's not being negative. It's just saying these are things that we need to factor in.
Well, the reason I said that is because when I think of agriculture in space, I've got one problem, and I've heard one problem. So the herd problem is pretty straightforward to understand, which is if you're growing a plant and begin to form attachments and they die, we're not quite sure on a 6-month mission, but is there a psychological aspect? Because we all know, in air quotes, that
that's very interesting. And those are the kind of things we need to think about.
having plants in the house is psychologically beneficial, and probably especially true on a spacecraft where everything's silver or white with some block printed lettering. So that's one thing to just consider and see how that works out. And that's probably pretty testable in analogs.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's been explored very far. The other one about really talking about large scale agriculture is, or larger scale, is if you're dependent on food, then you have to start considering the issue of famine in space if your crops fail for whatever reason. And I find that an interesting thought only because, and I haven't done a lot of research on it or looked into it really very much at all, but the level of commercial agriculture now probably has some deep insights into the reliability of crops. And I don't think any of that's really been discussed when we talk about space agriculture. But if you were dependent on that as part of your food system, if I'm designing hardware, I have one or two backups at least for whatever function I'm doing.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I mean, how many, given weight, mass, all the other problems, how much redundancies can we actually build into deeper space missions?
And you know, what is the right level? So if you can establish a level of confidence in your wheat harvest that you're happy with, then you can go with that and have fresh bread. But if you can't, then you have to decide whether it's worth having any of that or whether it's worth just packing saltines.
Yeah.
Like I said, if you looked at it more of an enhancement than a
Which
supply,
I love that idea because that's
if it
really
fails.
constrained agriculture, but probably would be incredibly beneficial.
No, it's really interesting. I remember you mentioned this before, the crop failure thing, which I hadn't really thought that much about. But the whole idea of the attachment that humans as a species have to our pets, to plants, and especially up, on a mission where the plants may be, other than the other crew members, the only living thing that you're relating to. The impact, psychological impact if they die. The other thing I know that you've talked about a lot is the whole problem of, and I know not only with food, but you talked about this with medicine, because that was one of the areas with deep space health, was shelf life.
Yeah, I mean that's the real problem. We have never, nowhere, been in a place where you could not have food resupplied at least annually. None of the Arctic expeditions did it, including the early ones. It is completely out of our league. And so having at a minimum a 3-year shelf life, and more likely closer to 5 when you count the time it takes to make the thing, pack the thing, then pack that thing in the spacecraft and ship the spacecraft ahead. It's probably a 4 or 5 year logistics train.
We haven't even talked. Really can't. The other issue is that think about a capsule. I always think about when you talk about Mars. It's, when you get there, whether you orbit or you land or whatever the situation is. But the idea of spending 6 to 6.5 months in a capsule, where you're really going to be limited by a lot of stuff, including the fact that, I think I'm correct. I'm not a physicist, but I think there's no sense of movement, right? You're going, and the only sounds are what's ever keeping the spacecraft going, and it's total darkness. And so you factor all that stuff in too. But that's another added. Again, the difference between the moon is far away, but it's nothing like Mars. The challenges between those two are.
And that's the interesting thing about Gateway, because of the specific orbit in Gateway. Quite frequently, the moon may not be visible, so they're beginning to get a sense of what it would feel
Because
like.
it's that far.
Because
that's interesting, given the orbit.
Yeah, so it's in a. Never mind. We're not talking about Gateway.
No, that's okay. But I think what I hear everybody saying maybe is that, and there's been this debate. Forget the moon, go on to Mars. Of course, that was one of the big issues with Elon Musk at SpaceX for a decade or so. He recently kind of pivoted and said, "Well, maybe the moon's maybe that's what we should be doing right now." And I think it's for reasons, because a lot of things we talked about today. But I kind of hear you all saying too that that's the way to go. The moon first. Test as much of this stuff as we can, whether it's food or health or radiation exposure.
And it is a fantastic testing ground.
Yeah, and we need to do that first.
That's the thing, is the moon is a great testing ground. The G factor is very similar. So we didn't talk about this, not part of this conversation, but the idea of you get in a spacecraft, you go for 144 hours, and then you set down on a quarter G moon, How is that compared? We know what it looks like when you're sitting in space for 6 months and you land on the steppes of Russia, on the steppes of Russia, or in the ocean, which is even worse, because first you puke, and then you get on the boat, and then you go and rest. What it takes for somebody we don't know how long it's going to take to adjust to quarter G, and we don't know whether that's going to help undo some of the things that happen.
Right.
So, the moon would give us a second gravity point, which we don't have at all. We have a microgravity. We have one, and we have close to zero.
Yeah. What is it on Mars?
It's about a third.
About a third, too?
Yeah, it's a little more than the moon, but it's not that much more.
And is it? Yeah. And so I think I've noted. In my perception, over the past couple of years, there really has been a measurable shift to the moon. There was a big 4, 5, 6 years ago. There was a lot of debate going on, but it seems to me that again, there's been a demonstrable shift toward first the moon, then beyond that.
Yeah, Mars is romantic, but in terms of engineering design and problem solving, the moon is relative, and it's not even close. It's 144 hours, so if there's a major issue on the moon, you have to survive for 144 hours, and that's
we just saw the incident on the station where they had to bring a crew member back because of a health issue.
Station was within 1 day you should be able to get back to care, and on the moon it's potentially you're going to be sitting in a spacesuit for 144 hours before you can get any care. But that's still better than 6 months.
Oh no,
Far better.
Well, if something, on a 6-month journey, if something happens, they have to. They have to resolve it, or something bad's going to happen. There's no way. There's no rescue of any sort.
Right, and that's again the psychology of the moon is so much nicer because you can get psychologically incredibly remote, but there is still an opportunity to control whatever situation until you can get to care.
That was great. It was interesting. I learned a lot. Made notes.
I had fun looking it all up and bring it all back.
The other thing I think would be, and Bob is one to. I think this would be interesting again to maybe pull together a small group of people and brainstorm this. Is the whole issue of smells. Are there ways of creating, not necessarily in the food, but even in the, maybe you're eating and you're also getting this little thing that has no weight that gives you a smell. That would be an interesting conversation.
Well, that's one where I think I don't know if we'll do it.
So to have this kind of conversation with a little bit of a focus on Kentucky and talking about some of the precedents and things and some of the ideas we talked about, and say, this would be a really good thing for someone in Kentucky to pursue.
Right.
Would be interesting. So I think we'll do that because that goes to a different. That's a different audience.
Especially when they're dual. Like the nutrition.
Thank you for joining us to talk space over coffee. The program is brought to you by Humanity in Deep Space. This episode was moderated by Kris Kimel. Joining Kris were Mike Canga and Bob Perry. Our coffee-making percussion theme was designed by Lawrence Wickham at Rhythm Me This. Talking Space Over Coffee was produced in Lexington, Kentucky by Kris Kimel and Arthur Rouse through the facilities of the Media Collaboratory. Look for more episodes of Humanity in Deep Space on YouTube, Facebook, and the web, or you may contact Kris by email. We'll see you next time, Talking Space Over Coffee.